Most founders sound exactly like the competition. If you want to be competitive in a crowded market, you can't just be better, you have to be different. I'm your host, Cameron Olds.
And I'm Dallin Merrill, and we're here to talk about how you can avoid being mistaken for your competition, differentiate your brand, and ultimately create a lasting competitive advantage for yourself in the market.
Welcome to Differentiate or Die. This episode of Differentiate or Die is brought to you by MessageOS. And by brought to you by, we mean written by.
If your team describes your product 10 different ways, your product is no longer differentiated. It's confusing, and so are your customers.
MessageOS helps big teams keep every sales deck, social caption, and support reply on message and on brand.
Clear, consistent, differentiated. Every time someone talks about you.
See how it works at protagonistcomms.co. Derrill, Merrill, I am excited for today. I'm just going to jump right in. I'm excited. Do you know why I'm excited?
You got sleep last night?
No, not last night, actually. The night before I did, though. Last night she was fussy.
Why are you excited, Cameron?
Derrill, I'm excited because I don't know if you know this about me, but I am a classically trained journalist. Did you know this?
What do you mean by classically trained?
I went to school for it. I went to school to be a journalist. Now,
Does that mean there's a modern way of being trained as a journalist?
probably. In fact, we're going to talk about that today. But, well, you know this, Becca, my wife. We both have the same degree. Did you know that?
Wait, you do?
Yeah, just different emphases. So I emphasized in PR, and she emphasized in print journalism. But both, it was a degree in journalism was the degree we got.
I had no idea you both had the same degree.
We have the same degree. Isn't that crazy?
That's really cool.
All in college, I was looking at news articles, and I was learning how to write news articles, and how you do it, and what the nut graph is, and the inverted pyramid, and all this stuff, And so today's matchup is something that I think is pretty freaking cool. I think everyone else is going to find it pretty freaking cool too. And it is the New York Times. Have you heard of them? Do you know who they are?
No, I think a little bit.
The New York Times versus Axios. Have you heard of Axios before?
That one I have never heard of before, if I'm being completely honest.
It's okay. They're the new kids on the block, but I think they're doing some really, really cool things. And maybe I'm coming in a little biased, but I think they're actually pretty, spoiler alert, I think they're pretty differentiated. They're pretty cool. I can't wait to talk about it today. It's going to be really, really good.
Great. Well, let's get into it. Tell me a little bit about, I'll do the introduction to New York Times, and you can do a little bit about Axios. So,
okay, let's do it.
Pop quiz. When was New York Times founded? You might know this already, but it's a long time ago, 1851.
Yeah, I know it was a long time ago, but that is a long time ago.
Yeah. I mean, it reminds me of like Newsies, It just, when I think New York Times, I go way back in time, and news is a big deal, right? Back then.
It's like 125 years old.
Right? You can, in today's world, consume content in a lot of different ways, right? We're doing a podcast right now. That's a way to do it. But way back then, the only way was, newspapers. If you wanted to know what was going on over in Europe, they'd have to ship a newspaper across the ocean. If you wanted to know what was going on in New York, they would ship the newspaper over here to Utah or wherever you were at. So the New York Times definitely captured the market of the U.S. Pretty early on. They are publicly traded, and they were founded by a journalist, Henry Jarvis Raymond. He should probably be a legend. Everyone should probably know his name. And then the investor was George Jones. The banker.
George Jones.
no, maybe his name should be more, no, just kidding. The writer, right? I mean, he's the one that really brought it to light. So,
Is it blasphemous that I've never heard of either of those two people?
George Jones, no, that's fine. But you should probably know Raymond's name.
He's probably rolling in his grave somewhere. Oh, well, that's fine. But yeah, New York Times is they're the big juggernaut. They're the big hitter. Everyone in the world, even outside the United States, probably reads the New York Times because they're just all encompassing. They're global. They're covering everything at once, right?
Yeah.
They're big. So now let's talk about the new kid on the block. Let's talk about Axios. So New York Times was founded in 1851. Axios was founded in 2016, maybe even 2015, 2016. So New York Times is 125 years old. Axios is 10 years old. And they are headquartered in Arlington, Virginia, and they are privately owned by some type of family office called Cox Enterprises, who I think buys and sells newspapers. That's beside the point. So the origin story of Axios was they were co-founded in 2016 by Jim VandeHei, Mike Allen, and Roy Schwartz. And all three of those guys were pretty big names over at another newspaper / studio organization called Politico. And so if you guys watch the news, if anyone watches the news or reads the news, you're probably seeing these names all the time. New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, Politico, The Hill, maybe even Axios sometimes. But anyway, so these three guys, Jim, Mike, and Roy, were all big wigs over at Politico. And they had kind of become jaded and cynical, maybe not cynical, but they were definitely jaded about the whole news organization, the news apparatus in America. They thought it was too long and too boring. Sometimes they even thought it was scammy because you're intermingling ads and editorial content with what should be facts-based reporting. And so they were just kind of this is not what we think news should be. And so they're like, F you, we're going to go start our own thing. So they all left Axios. They all left Politico and they started Axios. And what they've done is really, 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 really cool. So who do you want to look at first? Do you want to look at New York Times or do you want to look at Axios first?
Ooh, let's start with New York Times.
Cool. Okay. So we can look at their website real fast. And then we could just jump into an article. Just because newspapers it's not direct to consumer, so they're not going to have a whole bunch of great messaging on there. But here we go anyway. So share my screen.
And it's always changing, right? Yeah. I mean, and this is a really actually cool conversation of we talk about this a lot with stores, right? They need to have messaging even though people want to go there to shop. Mm-hmm. For New York Times, it's still a shop, right? They're still selling something on their website. Yep. So how do you get your how do you share your messaging without taking too much space before getting into the content?
That's a good question. Actually, the Washington Post might actually be an interesting answer to your question. We're not comparing them, but they might be interesting because they do have this little mantra called it's at their header that says "Democracy dies in darkness." Right under the logo, right under the Washington Post, it says "Democracy dies in darkness." I wouldn't call that product messaging. You're not talking about you're kind of talking about the product, but you're not talking about the problem it solves. You're not talking about what differentiates you, because the same thing we were talking about in other episodes with other people. It's just table stakes. And this is what I think the trouble that New York Times gets into, and New Washington Post and The Hill and all these guys, is they're reporting on the same news. They're all working from the same set of facts. So-and-so said this, so-and-so did that, country A did this to country B. There's no, I'm sure you could find people that would argue that they'd fudge things in the facts or whatever. But generally speaking, history is finite. Something happened, and there's one story to tell. Maybe you could tell from a bunch of different perspectives. But by and large, everyone's just looking for accurate reporting. And so this Washington Post thing where it's democracy dies in darkness. It's okay, cool. Well, if your whole thing is to bring, speak truth to power and bring information to light, it's well, so's the New York Times and so's The Hill and so's Politico and all these other people. So what differentiates you? That's the big question. from a newspaper? What differentiates you? Maybe you could differentiate yourself like off of location, because you could have like New York Times is a big national newspaper, international newspaper, but then here in Utah we have like the Salt Lake Tribune. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself.
No, I think that's great, and I would completely agree. In fact, I think originally that's why the New York Times became big, right? Everybody wanted to know what was going on in New York.
Right.
That's where the hub was. If you left New York, you wanted to know what was going on there, because that's what you would talk to your neighbors about. That's what would depend on the next shipment of letters, or that it changed your land boundaries. There's so many things, right? Like New York was the hub, it was the source of information, and so originally location was a big deal. Now it's not about New York, right? It's about the name brand and world information, right? People want information here. I mean, specifically U.S., right? They're not going to be reporting on local China news unless it affects the U.S., right?
Right, 100%. So, table stakes is good reporting, factual reporting, unbiased reporting. That's the other thing too that we can maybe talk about another time, is how everyone claims they're unbiased, but it's like, okay, that's table stakes. That's table stakes. Everyone's unbiased. Everyone claims to be unbiased, so that's just what everyone expects. So what else you got? But we're looking at here at the New York Times, and I mean, we just see today's headlines. At the time we're recording this, like Iran and Israel and Trump are having a spat, and so that's at the front line, like on the headlines, and so we have a whole bunch of other news articles about things that are happening in the world. And I would imagine that every other website would probably look similar to this in terms of this is just what's happening in the day. But
and especially so because everybody wants to know the biggest news, right?
Right.
Like if I'm partial to one of these newspapers, I still want to know what's the biggest news now. So it's going to be the first thing you see.
Yeah.
Maybe down lower there's some differences, but the main headlines, the very top of the line, is all going to be the same, most likely.
Above the fold.
Yeah.
So I think all newspapers across the board could probably do a little better on just touting their differentiation up front. Like everyone could just do a little better at it. But the thing I wanted to talk about today was, hey, let's look at the articles. Let's look at how the articles look, how they're formatted, because I think that's the big difference. So if we click into the number one headline, if you scroll down, we've got like the headline, how Trump shifted on Iran under pressure from Israel. So like there's the headline, that you've got like what they call the nut graph underneath that, which is just like a DH2. And if you keep scrolling all the way down, just scroll through the article. Let's just scroll through the article all the way down. Okay, so I mean, like, what do you see, Derrill? Like, just
lots of big paragraphs.
Lots of big meaty paragraphs. Just lots of information to sort through, right?
And with advertisements mixed in between.
With the advertisements mixed in between. So one, just kind of like a bad viewing experience, right? Just reading experience. Like I have to read a lot of really complicated information, and then I'm also getting ads in between paragraphs. So so just kind of a bad thing. Now, some people really enjoy, I would imagine, would really enjoy just diving in and reading the paragraphs and getting a really, really in-depth knowledge about, or an in-depth reading about what is actually happening in this article. That's what all newsprint looks like. It's all just big paragraphs. You have to constantly sort through. You're constantly having to read through these big paragraphs. But no one reads today. no one goes and reads big paragraphs. Everything is built around scanning, short attention spans, TikTok, Instagram. It's all short captions. Say it in 10 seconds, or you don't say it at all, right? And so This is what Axios, I think, keyed in on. This is one of the things they were like, the news experience is a bad experience. We're going to completely format our stuff for readability, legibility, and scannability. And so that is what they did over at Axios. Is they created their own writing format called Smart Brevity. And so here's what Axios looks like. So a comparable story about the Trump-Iran-Israel thing. But if you look down here, what's the difference, Derrill? What are you looking at here?
Yeah, I mean, why it matters, driving the news, some bullet points, what they're saying. So easily digestible.
Yeah, easily digestible, short paragraphs. So the whole thing is based off of this framework called smart brevity, and it's this format. It's this I wouldn't call it a framework, maybe it is, but it's basically just a text format. Their whole thing is, hey, how do you say less but have it be a higher quality? So it's more nutritionally dense than maybe what the New York Times is doing. So we have, I mean, the longest paragraph is 3 lines, right? 3 lines, nothing longer than that.
What's below, Cameron? Or is that it? Is everything else?
That's it. And they're really
that's
short.
the whole thing.
That's the whole thing.
Yeah.
So you get these, in addition to like the short paragraphs, you get these bolded paragraph starters. They call them axioms. And you were reading them earlier, like why it matters, driving the news, what they're saying, Trump himself signaled. So they're almost like chapters. You can just really briefly scan and kind of pick what you want to read and get really, really bite-sized stuff. And they incorporate bullet points and quotes. So this was like how they chose to, I think, differentiate themselves is, hey, we're going to format our stuff for readability and legibility, and we're going to build a whole news business out of it, just based off of smart brevity. And they've only been around 10 years, but they're hanging with the big boys. They're hanging with Politico. They're hanging with New York Times. They're hanging with the Washington Post. And I have to wonder if it's just like, hey, we don't have as much money as the New York Times. We're not as reputable or as, we don't have old money like the New York Times. So what's our differentiation strategy? How are we going to be different? How are we going to force a choice instead of a comparison? And I think their answer was smart brevity.
Yeah. And I think it really goes along to what we were saying initially or what we always say is, that doesn't mean people don't want the New York Times, right? Mm-hmm. I think they're going after a different demographic here. An older demographic probably wants New York Times because they want the whole story. It probably has some opinions in there, right? Mm. It's probably a little more opinionated than something like Axios, because you've got your news writers on the ground and whatever. So someone that subscribes to the New York Times that's paying for it behind a paywall is like, I want a lot of information. I am going to read all these newspapers. And I want it to be like a book, right? I don't want it to be bullet point, easily digestible. I just want to know it and get out. They want to sit down, read the newspaper, and enjoy it.
Yeah, I love what you said. It reads like a book. The difference between reading like a book and, I guess, Reader's Digest. And I agree that maybe it's a different demographic. I imagine that probably a lot of older people read the New York Times, but maybe a lot of people from our generation would be more comfortable with the smart brevity format over at Axios. But Definitely. Again, they've done a good job, even just in the conversation we're having, creating that dichotomy in our heads, I think is an indicator of a successful differentiation strategy. Well, okay, so let me ask you, Derrill, are these two differentiated or are they the same?
Yeah, they're definitely different. A lot of the information's the same. Mm-hmm. I would prefer Axios. I don't have all day to read a New York Times article. So they got me. They definitely differentiated enough to where I would prefer to read on Axios than on New York Times.
Yeah, definitely. I think, going back to some of our previous conversations, the 3 ways you could differentiate yourself on product, sales channel, and target audience. Maybe a little bit on target audience, like you and I talked about, just barely, but also for sure on product. Like their product, their articles are different because they're formatted different. So I think it's a resounding yes. It's a brilliant strategy, I think, the way that they've done it. And they've been successful too. And the crazy thing was, I was reading is during the pandemic, they refused government subsidies and what do they call those during the pandemic? It wasn't
The
buyout.
grants?
Yeah, they refused grants because they were profitable.
Wow, that's awesome.
They turned a profit in 2 years. I think they got like a $10 million angel investment, and they were profitable year 2 because they were really, really lean and mean, and they were different. So I mean, I think Axios is a crazy cool case study on if you're going to tackle a big boy, incumbent, entrenched juggernaut, like this is a way I think you should do it.
Yeah, I think what's really cool about and unique about these articles, all of them, is that they follow the exact same format, right? They're all going to say why it matters, driving the news, and what they're saying, right? So, it's like it makes it really, really easy for someone to come in and know all of the important parts and follow the format really, really easily.
Yep, 100%, 100%. It's a cool thing. Now, that being said, I wish, just like how we were critiquing the New York Times, I wish that they would give some real estate on their website to touting that difference. I don't know how they would say it. News that you can read in 2 minutes instead of 5, or 2 minutes instead of 10, and still retain all the information. That would probably be the messaging, I would say. But that would be my only thing is, hey, I think you need to communicate the cool differentiated work you've done, because if you don't say it, no one's going to paint it. No one's going to know. Like, they're not going to find that out on their own. You have to tell them. Somehow.
Yeah. I mean, it could even be as simple as be the most interesting person in the room in 5 minutes. I mean, that's a little long, but becoming a lot of that, or becoming the most up-to-date, like being an up-to-date person in 5 minutes, look to the reader, see why they're there, why does the reader come to you, and then show that on your messaging in the main page.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming along the ride on this visit back to my roots, my journalistic roots, Derrill.
I love it. I learned a lot of new things today.
There you go. Me too. Cool. Well, we'll catch you next time.